Right, chaps, everyone's microphones are down. We have about 50 seconds.
Hey, Truthloaders! I am Michael Stevens from the YouTube channel Vsauce.
What was your background prior to being a kick-ass mortar?
15 seconds, guys. Right, 5 seconds. Mics are going up now.
Hello, it's Thursday and it's 1 o'clock. It's not 7 o'clock, but we are joined by James Corbett. So, hello, James. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, well, we finally got you on the channel. I should explain to anyone watching right now. Keep your comments coming in first and foremost, because we're going to be putting those to James. But we've been trying for weeks to get James on the show, and arranging a time between Japan and London's not easy, right, James?
It's extremely difficult, but here we are. It's late at night for me. It's the middle of the afternoon for you, so hey, let's do it.
Yeah, it's blaring sun. So, I've got your comments, guys, right here in front of me. I'm going to explain how this is going to work. Normally, as you guys know, we do a hangout at 7. We put the whole thing up. We've started to edit those down into shorter packages. We're going to do the exact same thing today. So you guys can shape a shorter package, which is going to sit up on the Truthloader channel. So keep your questions and comments coming in. But if you guys don't know James Corbett, as I said earlier on in a video I made before, check out his YouTube channel. Just Google the Corbett Report, and I think the top result is your website. The second top result is your YouTube channel. You have a lot of stuff on there, James, about the recent massive NSA kind of wiretapping scandal. It's something that we've done a lot of here. It moves so quickly, the story about Edward Snowden, that it's really difficult to stay on top of kind of every little development. But recently there was an article in The Guardian by Glenn Greenwald, the guy who broke the story, talking about how the New York Times had actually said that Edward Snowden had given all of his data to the Russians and the Chinese, and this has been used as a kind of tool to attack Edward Snowden in the American media. So why do you think there's such a huge backlash against the guy who, well, essentially has done what journalists have always done, which is blown the whistle on something he thought was wrong?
Well, that's a good question, but I think it answers itself in so many ways, because obviously, who are the people whose interests are hurt in this situation? It is the power establishment. It is the people who want to be able to keep this secret, and when their secrets are exposed, obviously that's a bad thing for the establishment in general. And of course, their take on it is that this endangers the security of Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that lie is worth the paper that it's printed in. Basically, what this is just the establishment trying to preserve its secrets at any cost, and anyone who fundamentally bucks against that is going to receive some backlash. Regarding Snowden giving his information about the NSA spying to the Chinese and the Russians, I tend to believe him when he says he didn't do that, but I think we'd also be naive to think that he got out of Hong Kong without the Chinese getting that information one way or another. Whether he gave it to them or whether it was simply acquired, I think everyone understands it was probably taken in some form. But again, I don't think that that's, I certainly don't believe that he's a spy for the Chinese or the Russians or anything of that sort. And we'll have to see what happens from here. But of course, as we know, he's stranded in Moscow at the moment. And WikiLeaks promised on their Twitter feed that there was going to be some sort of campaign starting on Wednesday that so far hasn't materialized, or they haven't updated us about it. So we're still not sure what's really going to happen with him.
But he's still able to give interviews, which I find kind of fascinating, from wherever he currently is in Moscow, or not technically in Moscow. He's still able to give interviews. But we did a video. What I found interesting about your channel, James, is that as I looked through some of the stuff, I caught up on some of the videos you've made recently. You cover very similar topics to the ones that we do here on Truthloader. And we did a piece about the history of this wiretapping thing and how it actually dates back to much further than Edward Snowden. It doesn't start here. There have been whistleblowers before. Russ Tice. You have a fascinating interview with Russ Tice on your YouTube channel. Maybe you could kind of summarize what you found out from Russ Tice in that interview, and of course we'll direct people to it as well.
Right. Well, just to set the table for everyone, Russ Tice was one of the original NSA whistleblowers. In fact, as far as I know, the first NSA whistleblower to come forward by name to blow the whistle. And he was one of the sources for the New York Times' original story back in 2005 that broke the warrantless wiretapping scandal. That basically the NSA was going around the FISA court that they were supposed to go to get a warrant to spy and wiretap communications. The New York Times broke the story. They're going around that. They're not using that system. So that was a big scandal back in 2005 that eventually went through the legislative process in the United States, and they made it retroactively legal to do that, which is one of those interesting little things that can happen in politics. So he was one of the sources for that story. In 2009, he went out on national television again in the U.S., basically saying, listen, the NSA is also spying on journalists, and they're listening in on what journalists are saying and who they're talking to. And amazingly enough, that caused zero waves at the time. It was there on national TV. He gave some interviews about it with Keith Olbermann. No one picked up on it. No one really talked or ran it with that story. And then just a couple of months ago, just before this Snowden story broke, we had the AP spying scandal, and suddenly it was news again that journalists are being spied on. So he was a few years ahead of that. But now, yes, he's just come out and he's given some interviews with BoilingFrogsPost.com, with my website, the Corbett Report. He was just on RT giving another interview. Basically, he is now naming names, saying that when he was working for the NSA about 10 years ago, he physically held in his hand the wiretap orders for some of the highest-ranking politicians in the United States, including key ranking members of the congressional leadership, both Democratic and Republican, the ranking members of all the major committees, including the Judiciary Committee and other powerful committees. So every single one of the Supreme Court justices, he says, has been specifically wiretapped by the NSA. People like the former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who was the one who lied America into war through the UN, talking about the weapons of mass destruction and the lies around that. And even a little-known senator from Illinois at the time that was a political nobody at the time, but who is now the President of the United States, Barack Obama, was specifically targeted for wiretapping back in 2004. So some pretty remarkable revelations there.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at Russ Tice in our video. Sorry, James, if I'm looking over here, I'd just like you to know that I'm looking at you. I'm not, distracted by something else. But we did a video about the history of the NSA wiretapping. We looked at Russ Tice, we looked at William Binney, Thomas Drake, Mark Klein, like people had already spoken about this before. Russell Tice, I remember at the time, was kind of sidelined so quickly when he blew the whistle by mainstream news outlets who kind of challenged him so heavily that he kind of disappeared for a while and didn't speak so much about it. But when I looked on your YouTube channel, I found out that he had said, and this is the first I'd learned of it, that he held in his hands the paper order to wiretap a potential presidential candidate. It's a big deal. That's a huge, huge story. And yet, it's not to be disrespectful at all. Your channel is awesome. It seemed strange that this wasn't a huge story that was everywhere. It was on a YouTube channel. You know, it was here. Yeah. Why do you think it's ignored? This is such a huge story, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And it's not just by accident, it's not just by coincidence that this is being ignored. It is actually being suppressed. Russ Tice, after Edward Snowden came out, he had lined up 4 different on-camera interviews with national television networks in the United States. All 4 of them canceled before he ever got on air. And then he went out and did the interviews with Boiling Frogs and the Corbett Report talking about this wiretapping scandal. And after that point, he was scheduled to be on MSNBC. So he went and he went to the studio. He got the hair and makeup and lighting and everything ready. 5 minutes to air, they told him, we've checked with our lawyers, you can't talk about this on air. So all through that interview, all he's saying is, well, I'd like to talk about something that's much bigger, but I can't. So I'd like to have the opportunity to tell the American people what's going on. Just remarkable. He was specifically told he could not talk about that issue. So this is definitely something that's too hot to handle. It's interesting that Snowden is getting 24/7 blanket coverage with the PRISM documents, yeah, which again don't reveal anything fundamentally new. There's nothing really different in here that we haven't already known. And Russ Tice, an actual NSA whistleblower from a decade ago, is trying to bring new information, and no one is touching it. So I think this information is just too hot to handle.
From what we've learned from people like Russ Tice, William Binney, Thomas Drake, Edward Snowden, I saw a tweet from a guy called Jonathan Perkins. People on Truthloader may well have seen the long interview, much like this one that we did with John Perkins. He tweeted about the potential for blackmail, and within having this kind of data, within having data on Colin Powell, with having data on Barack Obama, a presidential candidate, the potential for blackmail is pretty big, and it's something that really I haven't seen discussed at great length. So what's your take on the NSA's ability to dish the dirt on people and kind of hold people to ransom for particular needs, perhaps?
Exactly right. Well, for people who don't know the history of intelligence agencies or how they've worked in the past, absolutely. Knowledge is power, specifically in cases where you can have dirt on someone that they don't want to get out there. Basically, you can control that person. And if that person happens to be, for example, the President of the United States with the Commander-in-Chief of the largest armed forces in the world, that's some pretty powerful leverage. So it's a really, really disturbing thing to think that there are people with goods, with details about some of these politicians that can really control what they do politically. And again, it's important to know that this is not something new. If people look, for example, at the history of the FBI, the first director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, managed to stay in that position for half a century because no one could fire him because he had the goods on all of the top-ranking politicians. He basically, the FBI, of course, in the course of their investigations, they would come across all sorts of juicy details on all of these political figures and judges and the like, and he would keep some of those key files in his own personal filing cabinet in his own office, and he had the goods on a lot of people. For example, there's the rumors that it was Eleanor Roosevelt's lesbian lovers. He had information on that. JFK and Marilyn Monroe's sexual liaisons. There's rumors there was actual recordings of that were in those FBI vaults, etc. Of course, all those documents got shredded and destroyed when Hoover died, but during his lifetime, he was able to have full reign over Washington, get anything he wanted for the FBI, and stay in his position for decade after decade after decade because he could basically end a politician's career like that with the kind of goods that he knew about in their closet.
It's interesting that you mentioned about how powerful people can become with this kind of data, and it lends to a question that James Hayden is asking here. Isn't Snowden a smokescreen to bury major news from the Middle East? So, in a sense, the direction this story has taken with Edward Snowden has kind of put the lens on you, normal people, right? So they're spying on your Facebook, they have access to your emails. Whilst the bigger story really is they can potentially blackmail whoever they want, but the story in the press is kind of morphed that way into one of privacy rather than one of who's really in control. But this is a question that James Hayden has asked that comes up quite often. Why is Edward Snowden's story so massive now? We've known about this kind of stuff for years, and yet here in 2013, it's this story that's just getting 24-hour coverage. And do you think it's a smokescreen, as James Hayden puts it, for something else?
Right. Well, I think there are three ways of looking at this story, and one is that we can just take it at face value, that here's someone who's coming out with some information and it's causing big political waves, and so suddenly there's political and public interest in this, so this is a story we should concentrate on. The other one is that this is a limited hangout, so basically that idea is that Snowden is coming out with information, whether he himself is doing this or whether he's a dupe for someone behind the scenes, but he's coming out with information that is just a little bit of the picture, just a few of the details, but not the big picture, so that we can fixate on those few small details and miss the bigger picture, like, for example, what Russ Tice is saying. And then there's the third possibility, which is that this is just a total smokescreen and the real action is happening somewhere else. I think that, in a weird way, I think all three are correct. I'm sure this is a smokescreen for things not only in Syria, but but a lot of other things are happening geopolitically right now, and this does create a convenient distraction. Whenever there's a 24/7 blanket news story, I think it serves our interest to take a look at what we're not being asked to look at constantly. So that's one thing. I agree that this is a possible, and it is being used as a smokescreen for a lot of different stories. Secondly, I think that it is also a limited hangout. As I say, I think the Russ Tice revelations and all of the other revelations we've had before, as you say, from people like Mark Klein, have confirmed for years and years and years that not only are they collecting metadata, it's not just about your location or things like that, it's literally the content of every single electronic communication is being copied and stored by the NSA forever. They are databasing it, they are logging it, they have it in their files. So that is the real big picture of the story that's being covered up by these smaller revelations. And then the third one is to take it at face value. Well, here is this guy, he came forward, he has this information, it's making these big political waves, but the public is interested in it. And to a certain extent, I say yeah, absolutely. Well, let's use that momentum for whatever reason and for why-ever this is taking place. At the very least, people are concentrating on this right now, which they've been ignoring for the past decade or so. Again, these whistleblowers have been coming out one after another. They've been being swept under the rug. Regardless of whether Snowden's a distraction or whatever, at the very least we can use the momentum of a story like this to try to bring people's attention to that bigger picture that we're talking about, the total surveillance that's going on, and why the security state has to be dismantled, because it is getting out of control.
James, so eager were we to begin speaking about Edward Snowden, Russ Tice, the NSA wiretapping scandal that we didn't even introduce you properly to everybody.
Where
on
are
our
your
channel.
manners?
Yeah, exactly. How terrible. Of course, we can fix this in the edit, so anyone watching now will see. We'll solve this and warp time, and we'll put this right at the beginning, like we should have done. So there's two questions here from IGNat980 and Artrodeus. I always get YouTube name wrong because they're impossible to pronounce. So, are you a journalist? Are you a news person? To be clear, is Mr. Corbett a journalist or are you just a YouTuber? So maybe you could just explain a little about you and what the Corbett Report is.
I think the best way to describe myself would be to say that I am a nobody. And I say this advisedly, I say this repeatedly, I say it at every chance I get, because I have, over the past 6 years, built up an audience through my website, through my YouTube channel. I have a podcast. I do video reports for the Center for Research on Globalization and BoilingFrogsPost.com. I write editorials for the International Forecaster, the former newsletter of recently deceased economic analyst Bob Chapman. I have my finger in a lot of different pies. But the thing that I want people to understand about this is that I was never professionally trained as a journalist. I didn't go to school to do this. I never expected to do this. And never, if you asked me 7 or 8 years ago what I was going to be doing with my life, never in a million years would I say I would be doing something like this. I never wanted to be in the media. I never wanted to be part of it. But I got to the point where I was coming across information to do with things like 9/11 truth and things to do with the economic system and the monetary system that were just so completely off the charts for me. The type of information that I'd never encountered in any of the mainstream sources that I'd ever been to. That I went and I personally verified online some of these facts that people were talking about and saying, how come that's never been presented to me? And it was just that disparity between what I was seeing online and what I was seeing in the mainstream sources that was just too great. And I thought, well, I have to do something to do that. So I started the website, and I've been doing this for several years now, and I hope I'm getting better and better, and perhaps even more professional, although that might not always be a good word, but getting more professional and getting better at what I'm doing. But I always want to stress that I'm a nobody, and that anyone, literally anyone in the audience out there could be doing what I'm doing, and I always exhort and encourage people out there to do this, because we are living in an incredible time right now where literally we have more access at our fingertips at any moment in time than even presidents would have had a few decades ago. It is incredible the amount of information we have through this technology and through the internet, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to really use it to its maximum advantage. And I don't claim that I have all the solutions to everything or that I'm right about everything, but I do think that if everyone starts to participate more actively in this conversation, it's going to be a lot harder to control people generally than what was possible in the past. So I always try to stress that I'm a nobody and that anybody out there could contribute in the ways that I've been doing, and I always try to encourage people to do that.
Awesome. I think that's an experience kind of a lot of people would say they shared, growing up with 28K modems, then 56K modems, and then broadband, and all of a sudden video arrived, and with it came all of these documentaries and websites and articles that you're thinking, I've never seen this before. It's kind of addictive and strange, and everybody just piled in. It's a fascinating thing.
It's amazing to me to think there's a generation growing up right now who is growing up with the internet. They've never known a life without the internet. So for someone from my perspective, I grew up as a child. Obviously, we didn't have the internet. So I think just having that perspective on it, I really do appreciate just how important this is right now, and just how amazing. I mean, even what I'm doing right now for a living, doing my website, doing these video reports, would have been literally impossible just a decade ago with the types of technologies we had then. So it's just mind-bending how quickly society's changing, and I really hope people appreciate that and start using it, because it has never been cheaper, easier, or more convenient to spread your ideas and your opinions to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially. It's a remarkable time to be alive in so many different ways.
So take that as an opportunity to leave a video response to this conversation. We never really ask for video responses, but hey, you just click on the upload button, click webcam capture, start talking to the webcam, and hey, we might be able to put it into the edit. So now we know who you are, James, kind of halfway through the interview, as is perfectly right in all interviews. Let's talk some more about Obama's war on whistleblowers. It's a really interesting story that Obama, I saw you speaking about his position as a presidential candidate and then president are kind of very different. And he's come down hard on a huge range of whistleblowers. So what's your take on that? Why do you think he's doing that?
There's a couple of responses we could give to this. One of them is to say that the Bush DOJ kind of set up a bunch of cases that all started to come due and be processed as Obama hit the presidency, so that it's not necessarily Obama personally that's doing this. It's not necessarily Eric Holder. I think of it more as a continuum. I mean, there is literally so little difference between the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, other than surface differences, that it's almost worthless, in my opinion, to talk about the Democrats and Republicans and that political football game as if it really matters in the big scheme of things. So it certainly is true that right now Obama, as it stands, Obama has initiated more prosecutions of whistleblowers under the 1917 Espionage Act than all other presidents in the history of the United States combined. And that's a pretty startling fact for someone who came in touting how he was going to have an open presidency and transparent government, and it was going to be a revolutionary hope and change, yay. So it is pretty remarkable to compare candidate Obama to President Obama, but it shouldn't be surprising. It really shouldn't be at this point in history, especially, I mean, decades and decades after we had one president that said to the CIA, I'm going to break you into 1,000 pieces and scatter you to the wind. And he ended up getting the back of his head blown off in broad daylight in Dallas in 1963. So I think the writing has been on the wall for a long time, how much control presidents really have over this. So I don't really concentrate on Obama per se in terms of this war on whistleblowing, but I think that this is just one more sign of the growing national security state. The CIA, the NSA, all of these agencies that the more information they get and the more they're able to do their operations behind the scenes under the cloak of national security, the stronger they get, the more brazen they get, and the more they have to hide, really. Even back in the 1970s, they had the Church Committee hearings that was held by Senator Frank Church, where they dug up some of the bones of the CIA, and they really started to talk about some of the things that the CIA had been up to in the past, including even talking about their heart attack guns and other things they were talking about openly in these committee hearings 30 years ago. I think the CIA might have learned their lesson from that, which is we don't allow that type of thing to happen anymore. So they ended up actually, during all of that kerfuffle, they ended up appointing George W. Bush as the director of the CIA. And despite having no previous experience with the CIA, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, no, he wasn't actually with the CIA back in the 50s, honest. But he became director, and suddenly the CIA stopped cooperating with the committee, and that got shut down. And since then, there's never been anything of that sort really happen. And George Bush went on to become president. Funny how that works. So I think that there's been a growing, encroaching sense that there's a national security state that almost operates as a second government. It's a shadow government that that people don't even know exists, let alone think to protest against. So when these whistleblowers come out, like a Snowden or take your pick, these people can potentially really change the system by at least letting people know what's going on, so, letting them know there is this shadow government operating behind the scenes, and that's a real threat to the system. So I think that's why there's so much pressure right now to try to crack down on these whistleblowers.
There's a question here from, if you give me a second to find it, it's from Renier Jose, who says, do the whistleblowers actually achieve anything? So I guess whistleblowers we can take for, well, take your pick. Let's start with Bradley Manning. You know, what's been achieved?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question, because it's really hard to think of whistleblowers who have really managed to achieve fundamental change in the system, and it's because the deck is so completely stacked against them that even when they do avoid prosecution, that it's still very difficult for them to get their case heard. I work with a whistleblower, an FBI whistleblower called Sibel Edmonds at boilingfrogspost.com. For people who don't know about Sibel Edmonds, I really hope they'll go and check out her story. It's an absolutely remarkable story. But the long and short of it is she was working in the FBI translation department just after 9/11. They were hiring people to deal with the backlog of translation in foreign languages, especially Middle Eastern languages at that time, obviously after the 9/11 attacks. And she basically started to encounter an espionage ring that was working in the Washington field office of the FBI that was trying to recruit her. It was related to Turkish nationals. She has this incredible story about nuclear espionage that was going on, stealing nuclear secrets, information that relates to 9/11, the fact that the high-ranking U.S. officials were meeting with Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's #2 man, all through the 90s, right up till 9/11. They were meeting and openly conspiring with Al-Qaeda to work in the Northern Caucasus region, which is a fascinating area that doesn't get a lot of attention except for the Boston bombing case, etc. But anyway, so she has this remarkable story, and she went through one of the first volleys in this modern day war on whistleblowers. She had the state secrets privilege invoked on her, which is this draconian law that had hardly ever been used in the history of the United States before her. It's now become, unfortunately, much more common to deploy against whistleblowers. But basically, it stops those whistleblowers from having a First Amendment right to free speech, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a country that believes that they're founded on the principles of the Bill of Rights and those fundamental rights. So basically, all sorts of information about herself was classified that she could not say. She would have gone to jail. Where she was born, what languages she speaks, or how old she is, things like this. Which, the funny thing is, if she got pulled over on the side of the road for speeding and the cop asked to see her driver's license, would she be able to give it to him? Because all of that information, or some of that information would be on there, and that's classified secrets, right? So even some of the things that she had said to Congress, testified to Congress, was retroactively classified. So congressional testimony that was on the record was made classified after she had given it. Just a remarkable case. And she went through this big, long process, going through all the whistleblower channels, going through the judicial system, and eventually trying to go through the media to try to get some attention. And basically, after this decade-long struggle, she's now pretty much completely on her own, doing it all through her own website. She had to self-publish her own book because no publisher would take it because they wanted to get official clearance from the FBI before they would publish anything from her. And all of this rigmarole. So I think people who've listened to her podcast and what she's talked about, she's really come through this on the other side, a very cynical person, basically saying, for whistleblowers, there aren't many options left. They give you all of these channels that you can take your case to higher levels of the government, and supposedly they'll look after you. But she's basically come to the conclusion that they're all fake channels, that basically if you have fundamentally damaging information, it's not going to get through that way. So one of the things Snowden said that I agree with is that he said this is going to, time that a whistleblower steps forward, it's going to be more difficult to do so. And this was something that Snowden was thinking about when he was thinking, how to physically do it. Go to Hong Kong and meet with the journalists and how to release the information and all of this. It's very, very difficult to do these days because of this war that's going on. And even when it gets done, even if there is information that gets out, what if it gets spun in the media? What if, for example, like apparently The Guardian and the Washington Post have done, they haven't published all of the slides that he gave them about the PRISM program, even though that was one of his conditions for giving them the story. So they're still sitting on some of this information, and maybe they'll give it out in drips and drabs a little bit at a time, but maybe they'll sit on some other things, because we know, for example, with the WikiLeaks case, with the Guardian and the New York Times and all of their media partners, they went to the U.S. government, they went to the Department of Defense to clear all of those leaks before they actually published them. So again, even if you can get around all of this and actually get some information out, there's still the mainstream news gatekeepers that keep this information out. So I agree, there's a lot to be cynical about. Can a whistleblower actually change the system? And I think the answer is no, not by themselves. If people take this information and do something with it and actually start to press on these nerves of power, there's the possibility that something can result of it. But when these whistleblowers are basically left high and dry and people just watch it as if it's entertainment, ooh, where will Snowden end up next, or something like that, if that's the attitude of the general public, then yeah, the whistleblower by himself isn't going to be able to accomplish anything. It's
interesting what you said about there being no proper angles for whistleblowing in the United States. Again, I refer back to the piece we did on the history of NSA whistleblowing. Thomas Drake was held up, or is often held up, by commentators in the United States as a guy who went through those proper channels, and he's compared to people like Snowden and Bradley Manning. Like, if they wanted to blow the whistle, those proper channels exist and they should have done it. But Thomas Drake was later charged under the Espionage Act for coming out and saying what he did. So maybe it is true that there are no proper channels through which you can do this. It's been a fascinating conversation about whistleblowers. We've spoken about the NSA wiretapping scandal, Edward Snowden. Another thing that I saw in your channel, James, that I found fascinating was your coverage of Bilderberg. And I've seen your video, perhaps you guys watching have seen James's video that went viral about 9/11, and right towards the end of the video you say, if you ever question any of these events, you're a baby-hating, all of those things. You included a clip of John Ronson talking about Bilderberg on a channel in the United States. I don't remember which one. I think
CNN.
I can't recall. CNN, there you go. And Nikki Campbell talking about Bilderberg on the BBC, and the general perception of speaking about some of these kind of issues as being sidelined. Let's keep the thoughts about this kind of weird stuff as weird and spooky and creepy, and I don't know, there's a kind of strange culture of discrediting this. So how have you experienced that yourself, and do you think that this is starting to shift and change?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that the conversation about things like Bilderberg is fundamentally changing now, and I can say this from even my own experience. I've been doing the Corbett Report for 6 years now, and I've been covering the Bilderberg conference each year. And even in that short time that I've been covering it, the difference between what was happening, say, back in 2008 to what was happening this year is just incredible. Not only from the public that is getting more and more aware of this, and for example, this year we had the Bilderberg Fringe Festival with thousands of people descending on Watford to show that their disappointment with the powers that shouldn't be, and that was a very hardening thing. But also the mainstream conversation is starting to change now. I think because the writing is on the wall for the dinosaur media, that they can't really exist in that gatekeeper paradigm that they did for decades and decades before, where basically they didn't talk about it, no one knew about it, and they set the agenda. That's really fundamentally changing right now, and I think the alternative media should take a second to pat themselves on the back for getting the word out about things like Bilderberg, and at the very least, it is being talked about now, and it's not exactly being taken seriously yet, but at the very least, the type of coverage that they're now starting to devote to this conference is admitting that it exists, which for a long time was the standard go-to. Oh, you think there's something called the Bilderberg Conference? You're crazy. And that was the standard put down. But now, at the very least, they're admitting it exists, and suddenly the people who have been disparaging it as saying, "Oh, you're just crazy for believing in it," now they have to change tack slightly. They have to say, "Well, of course it exists, but it's meaningless. Who cares? I mean, I don't want to know what they're talking about behind closed doors. You know, the richest, most powerful people in the world meeting with royalty, meeting with heads of government. It's no big deal." But if if there was a conference of 50 of the top sports figures in the UK, or 50 of the biggest Hollywood celebrities, every news media in the world would be flying helicopters over and doing anything they could to try to get coverage of it. But when it comes to Bilderberg, nothing at all. Well, that is changing, and there is, again, there's cause to be skeptical about what's going on. Are they just trying to focus attention on Bilderberg? Because again, this is just one conference, and it is an important conference, but it's by no means the end-all and be-all of everything. And even within the conference itself, it's about 150 attendees each year. The Bilderberg Steering Committee are the people who are really puppeteering that organization, and that's about 20 or 30 people at the sort of the core that are probably the more important people to be focusing on. And they can meet and do meet at all times throughout the year in different locations and things that the public just doesn't even know about at all. So to a certain extent, people are going to be cynical and say, well, yes, they're talking about the Bilderberg conference, but that's just a distraction from something else. But I want to concentrate on the positive side of this, because again, the alternative media really is starting to set the agenda. Not only coverage of Bilderberg, but in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing, we had mainstream news websites in the United States putting up headlines, "Was the Boston bombing a false flag attack?" I mean, things like that just blows my mind, because even 5 years ago, the general public didn't even know what a false flag attack was. They couldn't even conceptualize, why would a government attack itself? Well, that doesn't make any sense. And now, not only is that part of the mainstream parlance, but they're actually asking that, and of course dismissing it, but at least they're asking that in mainstream news headlines. It's a major, major change that's happening right now. And again, I think that if the people realize this, and if they push through with it, I think that we really can change the conversation that's happening at the very least. And I think that's the start of the change that we need to actually change the system itself.
James, it has been a fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we finally managed to get there with it and arrange the times from Japan to London so we can have you on the show, because as I predicted, it's been a great conversation. All the videos that we've spoken about, the one of Sybil Edmonds, the thing about Ross Tice that's on your channel, we'll like those videos, so all of you guys watching can go and check those videos out. We're going to cut this video together to make it shorter so you guys can digest it slightly easier. It would be great to have you back on the channel at some times, James, so do stay in touch.
I'd say any time, but I really mean any time that's suitable for both of us. But yes.
Yeah. At 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks very much, James. When this video is done, we'll send it your way, and you can maybe give it a thumbs up from your channel.
Absolutely. Well, keep doing the work that you're doing, and thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks, James. We'll see you guys again very soon. Thanks, James. Bye.